There are people, or there's a person who lives in a state of kedusha. Person lives in a state of holiness, sanctity. This is a person that lives from a place of transparency of the ego, a place of bittul, which is the transparency of the small I. And such a person recognizes that life comes from a higher order and that there's a deeper source to life. And therefore the person lives with a certain sense of openness and a submission to something that's higher, something that's transcendent. A person that lives this way, this means that they're living from a place of Kiddusha. And what that means is that the light of the soul, the deepest light of who they are, the spirit of their selves, of the deepest level of the capital self, radiates and flows harmoniously into the body, into the consciousness. And the body and soul are aligned and becomes transparent and receptive to each other. And there's a unity, there's a integration between the body and the soul. The ego becomes translucent and is not opaque and open to the soul. So therefore, the light in the vessel, which means the soul and the body, or the soul and human consciousness, the deepest level of the transcendent part of the soul, and human consciousness are unified as one. That's Iyu v'chayeu chad. That means that the life and the vessel are one. This is a person that lives from a state of Kedusha, a person that plays from holy. The opposite of this is the paradigm, of course, of klipa, concealment, constriction, blockages. Here the light of the soul is eclipsed, and the very essence of the person, which animates the individual, the life force, the chelik elokah, the divine life force that animates the person, of course, is still within the person, and that gives the person strength to exist. But the light becomes so submerged within the vessel, in the language of the Alter Rebbe in Torah and Toldos, it becomes nivla. It becomes completely absorbed or concealed, that the person no longer recognizes the light that's animating them, that's giving them chayes, that's giving them life force. And that life force becomes trapped and hidden within the person, and it becomes almost inaccessible. This is similar to what the Ramak, Moshe Kadavera, writes in Time of Devarim, where he speaks about the divine life force, that Hashem gives koyach, strength, to forces that seemingly are the opposite of the Creator, that are klipa, the opposite. And that's the ultimate savlan, the ultimate midah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, attribute of the divine, that gives life force to the things that are contrary to that itself. So this is a person that lives in a state of klipa. And when a person lives in a state of klipa, God forbid, when a person lives in a state of this concealment, so what manifests most in the person's life is their ego, arrogance, selfishness, hardness. They're stuck. They're connected to the narrative. Their energy is, so to speak, trapped within themselves. These two states are not just two different paradigms of two different types of people, but they actually exist within each one of us. And there are different states that we're different conditions that sometimes a person is more fluctuates into one, sometimes a person fluctuates into the other. There are times in a life a person feels fluid, open, transparent, expansive, and the inner light of the soul shines forth beautifully. And there are times when we feel constricted, defensive, reactive, stuck, attached to the narrative in a certain way. And a person becomes smaller. So instead of a person feeling the possibility of growth, of movement, a possibility, there's tightness, reactivity, underdevelopments. The person's just basically stuck. A person says, I have no choice, or I find myself in a situation. This is who I am. There's no possibility. Everything's against me. The world is against me. I must defend myself. All these type of conditions, these constriction perceptions, is just about me. It just becomes about the I, my ego, and therefore there's fears and entitlements and hurts. This is the level. This is the place when a person feels completely stuck, completely in a place of stuckness. And when this part of ourself rises stronger, and a person is more connected to the ego, defensiveness. So there's arrogance and anger and judgment and blame. And even on a somatic level, meaning on a body level, the person that's experienced this state of klipa, this state of stuckness, feels, the breathing is shallow and the tightness of chest and clenched jaws and hypervigilance. There's a reflection. The nervous system sort of shifts to a flight or fight mode, and this restricts this higher possibility of higher cognitive and emotional capabilities. And then there's like an body entanglement. The body is restricted. Now these two paradigms are illuminated very well in the Torah when the Torah describes the tension between the two twins, between Yaakov and Eisav, which, according to the Zohar, Yaakov and Eisav represents the body and the soul, or the Yitzchak and the Yitzhahara, the good inclination and negative inclination, or the world of Torah, of chaos, versus the world of Tikkun, the world of order. That there's sometimes a person is in a condition of Yaakov, and sometimes a person, God forbid, is in a state of Eisav. So how does one release oneself when their light, their inner spark is trapped within the body, trapped within, to use those words of the trauma of existence, it's trapped. A person feels stuck. And the chayas that they do have, the divine life force that they do have, is completely absorbed in the body. It becomes absorbed within them. That instead of feeling open and transparent and a sense of transcendence and bittul, it actually creates more chutzpah, more arrogance, more ego, more me or you, more sense of flight and fight. The nervous system breaks down. All this, how does a person untrap this energy, this chayas, this sparks? Now if you look in the Torah describes that Yitzchak desired to give the blessing to Eisav. It's not clear, and we've talked about many times, whether this is the only blessing that he wanted to give, or the physical blessing he wanted to give to Eisav, and the spiritual blessing he wanted to give to Yaakov, like Yaakov himself divides it between Yisachar and Zvulun, between the two tribes. Maybe Yitzchak was not privy to the prophecy that Rivka knew, that Shnei Goyim, that two separate people, two separate nations. Yitzchak thought maybe that Eisav is not only Yisrael Muma, but he's part of Yisrael. Either way, Yitzchak is Gevuras. Yitzchak is that place of very powerful, B'tzina Dekadid is a very powerful force. And Yitzchak desires to give the blessing to Eisav, which means, what Yitzchak wants to do was he wants to flood Eisav. This is the way the Alter Rebbe explains it in Torah. Toldos, he wants to flood Yitzchak, he wants to flood Eisav with a overwhelming surge of light. And just like a great fire draws smaller flames to it, the tzaitzes are drawn to the light, to their source, Yitzchak feels that if he overwhelms the system of Eisav with a tremendous amount of blessing, means a tremendous amount of divine illumination, it will break open the concealment, that things that are stuck within him, and it will release the sparks from the captivity. This is the hope of Yitzchak. What this means is that Yitzchak wanted to leapfrog the system, so to speak. And normally, this is Malchus, so represents or Olam Hazeh, the physical world. This is the light that's trapped. We use a different way of thinking about this, which we spoke about at length at different times, especially in some of the shiurim, some of the lectures on Sefer Yetzirah, that there's certain things that we carry in our body, certain deeply ingrained things that we carry in our body. There's this desire to release those sparks. Yitzchak wanted to leapfrog the system, meaning he wanted to overwhelm the Eisav, which represents a paradigm, represents of course it's a person as well, embodiment of a certain paradigm. He wanted to overwhelm this person, this character, this type of being with a tremendous amount of light. And that in itself would break open the person and allow the sparks to be released and return back to its source. This is like a modern, to translate this in a very modern way, in a 21st century way, certainly certain people feel like when they feel trapped and stuck, and there's no movement, that they need some type of overwhelming light to break open the system, and they wish to leapfrog processes. They want to receive something immediately, instantaneously, which is also possible, but it's another conversation. It's in a different context. But this is like sort of through a release of tremendous amount of light, and that will release the sparks that are trapped. And this is psychologically true and mentally true and emotionally true, the stuff that are trapped within you. But the language of the Alter Rebbe is that he says that Yitzchak, this was the mistake. Tol Yitzchak, of course, whatever on the level of Bar Kava, what this means, that he made a mistake. He said, Yitzchak Ratza Shi is Shalaya de Zorampin. This is the language of the Alter Rebbe, is that he wanted that it should be not through Zorampin, not through the small face, which represents the midah of Tiferes, which is Yaakov, which I'll explain what this means. She is Galas Oiris Oyonim Beisav Atzmei. That he should be drawing down from the lights of Talad Tika, a higher level of lights. This is what he wanted to do. But he says, Yitzchak, there was a mistake in this process. Why? Because the truth is that Eisav, this type of trapped sparks, and the world of chaos, the subconscious, whatever, or the deeply ingrained parts within ourselves, this cannot be elevated only through Yaakov, which is Zorampin. Because if you would reveal those higher lights to Eisav, either the lights will become again absorbed and nothing would change, and the person remains unchanged. Everything remains stuck just the way it was. The ego just hardens. And in fact, it becomes even more powerful because now it receives more light, and a person becomes even more self-absorbed, more arrogant, because now they drew in the lights of the higher light. In other words, nothing would happen. In fact, it has the counter effect, the counterproductive effect, which means you're drawing down a higher lights to illuminate that place of the darkness, to open up that place of the subconscious, to open a place within the body, the trap sparks within the self. So either it's going to create more arrogance because it's also become nivla, it's also going to become absorbed, and therefore it's going to go back into the context before, and you're not going to have, and it's going to be still the separation between the light and the vessel. So therefore you're going to feel only the vessel more, and therefore it becomes more self-absorbed. Or Eisav would disappear, or you'll overwhelm the system so much that the vessels shatter, which means psychologically that it creates instability or a breakdown. The light is too great for the current structure to hold. You reveal these higher lights, and it destroys the fragile container, which is the self. But he says, in order to truly transform the darkness into light and the bitterness into sweetness, you first need the process of Zohar Amtli Kedusha, which we mentioned last time in the Zohar, is that we need the midas, we need the emotional states. That the true tikkun, Yaakov represents the midah of Tiferes, but Tiferes refers to the entire structure of the six midas, the six emotions, the seven emotions. The emotions themselves, Zohar Amprim receives some bina, receives light. Everything receives light from the thing above. So the structure is that the emotions of a person receives light from their intelligence, which means the intelligence of a person, the mindset doesn't necessarily mean the thought process, but the mindset of a person is what dictates how they feel their emotions. A person that has intelligence and thinks about bigger things has higher emotions. It's the direction of the emotions are affected, not the emotions itself, because the root of the emotion is even higher than intelligence, but the directions of the emotions is based on the intelligence of a person, the way a person has a mindset. So to translate or to use the language of the Arizal, the language of Kabbalah, of Pnimius HaTorah, is that Zor Ampin, Tiferes, receives Chayas, Moichin, which is intelligence, which is Chayas, from Bina, from the place of understanding. And Zor Ampin gives Chayas, gives intelligence, gives life force to Malchus, or things that are trapped in the vessel, in the receiver, in the arrogance, in the ego. The correct path of truly elevating self and releasing the sparks that exist within ourselves is not through overwhelming the system in a way that leapfrogs the whole Zor Ampin and Bina. Not to go to a place of Chachma beyond, a place of Keser. Not to go to the place of transcendence and reveal tremendous amount of light. And that will break open the vessel. Maybe in certain conditions, maybe that's the only possibility. But in the normal course of events, that is counterproductive, because it doesn't create the right result. Either because then the person that's experiencing these things is higher light. And this doesn't necessarily have to do with something that's coming from the outside in terms of substance or other things. Sometimes a person could be also inspired by something that's external, which is not going through the intelligence of being, not going through the emotions, but a person is swept up by a certain euphoria or a certain condition. Let's say they're in a gathering of a bunch of people and everyone's singing, and they get swept up with this idea. So they feel a surge of tremendous amount of light, and that light is going to release the sparks. Says the Alter, two things can happen. Either what it's going to do is, after this experience that you're having, that was not created and was not formulated through your intelligence, through my mindset, I have a correct mindset, and my emotions, my Zor Ampin, my emotions is harmonized and is refined and is developed, which is Yaakov. It's in balance and it's in alignment, and it's a process. And finally, from that place of emotions, it finally opens up, and the sparks of my Malchus that are trapped are opened up. But it leapfrogs my emotions, it leapfrogs my intelligence. It's just, I'm swept up by euphoria. It says two things can happen. Either at the end of the night, at the end of the day, you're just going to feel more arrogant, or more stuck, or more depressed, more into your story, more opaque, less transcendent, less translucent, less transparent. You become even further stuck. Or you just experience a breakdown, which is, okay, I'm letting go of everything. I'm going to change my life completely. And of course, this could be an impetus, a good movement to start, but usually it creates this breakdown, because it's at like a certain high, and then you drop because the vessel is not ready. And this is on all levels of practice, all spiritual practice, psychological practice, spiritual practices, to understand that any method that tries to unleash rapid breakthroughs, to force the psyche to some type of enlightenment or openness and transparency, more often than not, such practices will just inflate the ego, create more self-importance, more stuckness, or it can completely destabilize the vessel. And the correct way is the way of Yaakov, the way of the Midas, the way of Zor Ampin. And that's the correct way of truly transforming ourselves, which means to have the mindset of what am I doing in my life, to have a correct understanding, then having my emotions aligned with that correct understanding of how I want to feel. Try to open your emotions, try to feel life, try to just feel alive, and then feel connected to self and to other, and to ultimately to the divine, ultimately to Hashem. And that's what we slowly are able to unlock. And even when we have experiences, because just being alive, sometimes we do have experience from these makifim, from the level of chachma, level of keser, from these transcendent spaces, there's a surge of light. We always have to ask ourselves, how could I take that light and really draw it down into my understanding, to change the way I think about myself and the way I think about life, and how I can draw that in an integrated way on an emotional level. And if I can do that correctly, then I can truly release the sparks that are trapped within my psyche, within my consciousness, and ultimately release the sparks within the world and bring the world to a more redemptive state.